Today we are going to explore the great paradox of modern American conservatism.
Oh.
That is the simultaneous downplaying of slavery as though it were a minor blemish in the extraordinary, successful, humane, democratic history of the country, and at the same time celebrating the Confederates who shed blood, were traitors, fought against their own country for the sole purpose of preserving the horrific institution of slavery. We'll explain why they're doing this and then unpack it and show just what a distortion it is of our history and how it comports with something that's been a major theme of this show, that authoritarianism does not rely alone on the use of the military and force, like we've seen Donald Trump doing. It also relies upon controlling what we believe and what we think, and that's what this is all about.
I want to give some shout outs to some people in the chat. Tina says, good evening, friends from Northeast Tennessee. Axel Moreno says, greetings from Houston, Texas. Abe says, we are live. Hello, Krasimir Bornayev, Michael Sheffield. Nice to see you all.
That's wonderful. We not only have a national audience, we have an international audience, right?
Yeah, if you're watching from somewhere outside the States, tell the chat. Let us know in the chat. All right, let's get into it, Dad. Are you ready?
I'm always ready.
Trump is slamming the Smithsonian for emphasizing slavery, calling it, quote, out of control, and warning it's, quote, too woke. This has, Dad, believe it or not, reignited a debate about slavery.
Can you imagine?
Online and in the media. Jillian Michaels, former star of the reality TV show Biggest Loser, now a conservative political commentator, tried to downplay slavery on CNN the other day, saying, quote, do you know that only less than 2% of white Americans own slaves? Trump White House official Lindsay Halligan, who is leading the review of content at the Smithsonian, said, quote, it's not about whitewashing. While slavery is obviously a horrible aspect of our nation's history, you can't really talk about slavery honestly unless you also talk about, quote, hope and progress. I'm sitting next to one of the most prominent historians in the U.S. Hard to believe we have to do this in 2025. But, Dad, can you school us on slavery?
Absolutely. Can you hold this for 1 second? I've got something on my phone that is going to guide us a little bit. Yeah. All right. The right would have us believe that slavery is a minor blemish because they want us to believe that the so-called pioneer generation of white Christian Americans were a great civilizing force in America. They talked about, them settling an untamed wilderness and bringing civilization. Never mind, the enormous indigenous people that lived there that were mostly wiped out in the wake of this. And because of this belief in the exceptionalism of these white Christian settlers, the pioneer generation, they don't want us to believe that slavery was a significant part of the American heritage or a great blot on the American record. And they certainly, and this is critical, they don't want you to believe that there's any legacy of past discrimination, whether slavery, Jim Crow, modern police brutality, discrimination in housing, healthcare, education, mortgage lending. They want to wipe all this out from the American experience and make believe we're a total meritocracy where race, gender, religion, ethnicity doesn't matter at all. And to do this, they create this mythical view of the American past. Slavery was fundamental to the origins and much of the history of this country. Do you know how long slavery lasted in America, Sam?
200 years?
250 some odd years, exactly. From the early 1600s until slavery was abolished in 1865. Now, the right wing and Donald Trump's 1776 project, which represented his politically driven right-wing view of history, says America was the leader in abolishing slavery. I've got some information here on that. Do you think that's true, Sam?
No.
Not even close to being true. The United States abolished slavery in 1865 as the result of a horrible, bloody war that wrought great destruction on the South, from which maybe a lot of it hasn't fully recovered, killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. That would project to many, many millions on today's population. Keep that in mind. 1865. Can you hold this so I can speak to it? Spain abolished slavery in 1811. You can do the math, Sam. For 54 years before America abolished slavery. Our neighbor Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, 36 years. The British and its colonies abolished slavery in 1833, 32 years before Denmark and its colonies in 1846, 19 years before. France and its colonies, 1848, 17 years before. And almost every Latin American nation by 1854, 11 years before we abolished slavery. This is part of a much bigger point that I want to make, Sam. Not only do they utterly distort the historical record, but it's not random distortion, is it, Sam?
No.
It's all in pursuit of a particular political agenda. And so, consistent with their view of the superior civilization brought by white Christian settlers, they can't believe that these settlers were somehow a terrible laggard when it came to the abolition of this horrible institution of slavery. And one of the things they also overlook is not just slavery itself was this horrible, inhumane institution, but there's something called the Middle Passage, which was unique to Western Hemisphere slavery. You know what that was, Sam?
The slave trade between Africa and the
exactly
or the Americas.
Over 12 million Africans were brought to the United States against their will, forcefully, in the Middle Passage. And according to historians who studied this, 1.8 million persons did not survive the Middle Passage. That is, in effect, the institution of slavery resulted in the murder. There's nothing, short of that, of nearly 2 million people. That is totally overlooked in the right-wing account of slavery. Then we also have not just the 1776 report giving us the view that they want to impose on everyone. We have the Trump and DeSantis approved Florida curriculum, which was notorious for claiming that slaves developed useful skills. Imagine that. Slavery was so benevolent that it gave useful skills to these horribly enslaved people. Well, what could they do with these skills?
Work for white people.
Exactly. And they couldn't accumulate their own money.
Or wealth, yeah.
Or build wealth. They couldn't have bank accounts.
No property, obviously.
They couldn't buy property or build their own businesses. They couldn't pass it on to their children or their heirs. So, this idea of all these useful skills has to be looked at not as if it was, some free person developing skills, but people in the context of the incredibly oppressive confines of slavery. But not only did they totally misrepresent the facts of slavery's abolition, they totally misrepresented this so-called acquisition of skills. They cited, out of millions of slaves, 16, Sam, who supposedly acquired useful skills. 16 out of millions. It's got to be their best, their aces, their A-plus examples, right?
Right.
Well, it turns out of the 16, 13 were false. Either they weren't slaves or they didn't acquire useful skills. Here are two examples, two of the most outrageous examples. George Washington's sister, his white sister, was named as a slave who claimed that she developed useful skills.
What?
Yes. I mean, these errors are so gross, so horrific, that they boggle your mind, don't they?
Yeah.
Here's another one. Ned Cobb. He was born in 1885. When was slavery abolished? 1865.
Yeah.
So he was born 20 years after the abolition of slavery. And, somehow is listed as one of those having acquired these useful skills. And as I said, about 13 of the 16, maybe not as egregiously as this, but were misrepresented, were false. So not only do they have ideologically driven views of slavery and its place in America and the world, but they utterly fabricate and distort the facts in producing that. And, they also claim, well, the slaves weren't so badly off. They got food, they got housing, they got clothing. Well, let me tell you a story. Way back in 1973, I was at a conference on slavery. And even back then, there was some issue about, how well the slaves were treated. And the late, great historian of slavery, Kenneth Stamp, told a story that summed it all up. He said, a slave named Joe from Virginia escaped, and he was caught and brought back to the magistrate, who knew him. And the magistrate said, Joe, why'd you escape? Was your master starving you? And Joe said, oh, no. My master was a good man. He wouldn't starve me. Well, didn't you have a place to live? And he said, oh, no. My master's a good man. He wouldn't leave me out in the open. Well, he must have been mercilessly beating you and whipping you. And Joe said, oh, no. My master's a good man. He didn't mercilessly whip me. And he said, well, he must have sold your family down the river to Mississippi, right? Joe said, oh, no. My master's was a good man. He didn't sell my family down the river. And the magistrate looked at him really with a perplexed look on his face and said, Joe, you had food. You had place to live. You weren't being beaten mercilessly. They didn't send your family down the river. Why in the world did you run away? And Joe looks at the magistrate and says, sir, the job's still open if you want it. Says it all. Now, this notion about 2% of white Americans owning slaves, that's irrelevant. All that shows is a relatively, even though it's wrong, a relatively...
Right. A lot of people online have already pointed out that that is not actually accurate, because if you take into account that only the southern population owned enslaved, only men owned slaves,
exactly.
Women and children were not considered slave owners, but they all obviously benefited from being in family. It's
totally wrong.
It's more like 30%, actually.
It's 27% of southern households own slaves. That's been documented by real historians, not by people like this guy who just makes things up.
It's a woman.
That's a woman.
Jillian Michaels.
I never heard of her. Is she a historian?
No, she was a reality TV star who's now a
Oh, well, that credential
talk show
certainly
host.
would
Yeah.
establish her as an authority. 27%. But the real point is not how many white Americans own slaves, which is over a quarter
Right.
of the Southern households, but how many African Americans were enslaved. You know how many African Americans were enslaved at the time of emancipation in the Old South?
I'm guessing like 1 million.
You're not even close. Nearly 4 million. I repeat that. Somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million enslaved persons. That's millions of people under the whip and lash, the horrible system of slavery. That's approximately half of the white population, which was 8.1 million. It's almost half of the white population were enslaved, oppressed peoples. So no wonder the Confederates turned traitor against their country and fought this bloody war to preserve slavery, because slavery was integral, essential. 5 to 4 million forced workers out of a white population of 8.1 million. Plus, of course, they were deathly afraid of slave revolts and slaves slaughtering white people if they were free. In fact, after the freeing of the slaves, just the opposite occurred. White people massacred and slaughtered freed slaves in places like the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana or the Eufaula Massacre in Alabama, as well as many others. So what did the white South do after slavery was abolished? They tried to recreate slavery.
Right.
Through the black codes.
Right.
Which came as close as you possibly could to replicating the horrors of slavery without actually formally reinstituting slavery. The black codes were abolished by the Civil Rights Act of 1966, the Reconstruction Amendments, and other initiatives. Then what happened after Reconstruction was over, Sam?
Jim Crow.
Jim Crow. Whites took over and, again, imposed the system as close as they possibly could to slavery. They snuffed out black voting. They segregated black people. They used the law enforcement system to prey on black people, from an all-white police forces, prosecutors, judges, and juries. And the prisons were about 80% black during this period in the South. And what did they have the prisoners do, Sam?
Slave labor.
Slave labor. First, they had the convict lease system, in which they leased out convicts to work forced labor on private plantations. And then when that faded away, they have something that, we've all seen movies and stories about, the notorious chain gangs. And the chain gangs actually were responsible for building a lot of the Southern infrastructure, including a lot of the modern Southern roads. Forced black labor. And as far as slavery, being a minor blip on the American horizon, as I said, it survived for some 250 years. The slave labor was essential. It was the keystone of the Southern economy, and not just the Southern economy. It was a critical element of the entire national economy. It was Northern merchants and traders who benefited from the slave trade. And monies generated by slavery promoted industry and investments across the country. A major contribution to our economy overall. So my point is, Trump and other right-wingers, and it's nothing new, are utterly distorting our history and our heritage. in order to promote their own political goals. Not just distorting how we understand history, but manipulating and fabricating and changing and altering the well-established facts of history. That's why when Trump's 1776 report came out, virtually every scholarly and academic organization in the nation joined the American Historical Association in condemning it as something that was not a work of history, but a totally politically driven document. And you could have seen the foreshadowing of what's going on now in that 1776 report. And even earlier, if you had looked at the textbooks and curriculum of conservative, private Christian academies, which are not controlled, right, by public institutions, but basically they can do what they want. And these distortions about slavery were already present in their textbooks and their teachings. You know, one of the most notorious, outrageous things we found was to call slaves immigrants. As though, like other immigrants, they had voluntarily come to this nation. And of course, no mention of the horrors of the Middle Passage or the nearly 2 million persons who died en route to slavery here in the U.S.
You know, this White House official who said that we need to talk more about hope and progress, I just find that so absurd, especially given their stance that they want to preserve Confederate statues, because those Confederate statues are a sign of the lack of hope and progress.
The opposite of hope and progress.
So, like, again, they're so hypocritical on this. And, you know, with this Trump administration, especially in this second administration, it really feels like every accusation is actually an admission. You know, they've been going on for years about indoctrinating kids with woke
left-wing bias,
right, and critical race theory and all this BS. And then they turn around and do exactly what they've been warning about for years. And 10 times worse.
10 times worse. It's not. It isn't even close. And so these two tendencies are one of a piece. You know, challenge the true history of slavery, distort the history of the Confederacy, and celebrate it. So these white Christian Southerners fit within this fabricated history of the advance of white Christian civilization. And by the way, telling the truth about slavery doesn't mean you can't talk about hope and progress, right?
Right.
They're not mutually exclusive.
They're on the National Mall. There's a monument to Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, he was the sign of hope and progress in the modern civil rights movement.
Right. A lot of the hope and progress occurred through those who fought against slavery, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. And by the way, if you look at those Christian conservative textbooks, they also demonize the abolitionists.
Of course.
Yes, of course. And, you know, celebrate the Confederates.
Again, I keep going back to this. Like, I just can't imagine the American, I can't wrap my mind around how American people are buying this, how they think the Trump administration is justified in all this. Like, yep, Confederate statues, we need to keep those up because we need to preserve history. But we need to review all the slavery stuff, but not any of the Confederate. Again, like, I just don't understand who is buying into this.
I wonder. I haven't seen any polling on this, but I can't believe that most Americans are buying into this.